Okay, so yeah, so I'll give you the background. So we are covering gradually, then suddenly. It's broken down into it's a book which was originally an article series. It's on the Nakamoto Institute. It's broken down into 16 article pieces. So these were published by Parker Lewis in 2019 as separate article pieces. But over the last 2 or 4 years, this has evolved into a brilliant resource for anybody who's just at the starting point of Bitcoin, where they're diving deep into what Bitcoin solves and how it works and why is it robust and resilient to attacks. So we have covered the first 9 pieces up till now, and this is the I think the short summary of how the book has evolved is that first few articles were mainly a lot of the comparisons with the altcoins, while also highlighting in the backdrop of how the Federal Reserve System works. So this is like the background on what Bitcoin is solving, especially in the context of a lot of noise of crypto and blockchain. So from my research and understanding, this article series was written at the time when block size wars had just commenced, sorry, just ended. And there was a lot of hubris and debate and controversies around how Bitcoin should evolve, what is the consensus mechanism. Those were the few articles on the first side of those breakdown. Then we went on to understanding Bitcoin's attack vectors of how Bitcoin protects itself against all sorts of attacks. So these were mainly technical. So for the last 2 or 3 articles, these were about the difficulty adjustment and how Bitcoin preserve itself against any attacks on increasing its supply and how consensus works. We discussed the 3 pillars of consensus, which, as I'm able to recall, were mining and proof of work being the first pillar. One was private keys and public keys, which was like the cryptographic security of control and ownership. And the third was not currently able to recall. I think it was decentralization of full nodes validating transactions and blocks independently without having to trust any authority. So it's a brilliant resource on how it's those 3 vectors are or pillars rather are independent from each other, but it's important for them to come together to create the system where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where individuals acting on their own incentives creates this system where it's life of its own and it does not need any centralization or authority dictating its evolution. And towards the latter phase, now I think we have started to come to more of the FUDs side. So FUDs is short for fear, uncertainty, doubt. So this is perhaps to a lot of you who might not be new to Bitcoin, pretty obvious that Bitcoin cannot be banned. But the point of this resource is to break down for the skeptics of the common concern that if Bitcoin is really what it is, the value proposition that it has, then the incumbent government-run monopolies will not let it evolve. So this is primarily for the people who are skeptical of why Bitcoin will not evolve because eventually it can get banned. So if you're at all technical, you understand that decentralization is the entire point of not letting any single point of failure creep into the system. But it's a good resource nonetheless, I believe, to just go over it in a more articulate way. But yeah, just giving that introduction. If somebody has any thoughts during the session, please feel free to just interrupt me and share the thoughts. The point of this session, in my view, is to have everybody learn something or get value out of it. So, however you think you want to ask questions or share your stories, please feel free to share it with us. Hi, Mango.
Hey guys, good evening.
So yeah, I was also just sharing this with Faisal and Jatin, and I'll just yeah, Mango. I've given the background. You've just joined just when we were about to start. So Bala shared a podcast which I found interesting, which covers some economic concepts of how there's a reserve currency paradox. This is just the high level ideas that I'll just share with you. I leave it at that. I was not able to understand a lot of the concepts, but I'm very curious to understand them. And maybe Bala, if he joins us, we can have a quick chat later. Okay. Okay, so I'll start now. Bitcoin Cannot Be Banned by Parker Lewis, first published on Unchained Capital blog. I think Nakamoto Institute is a better format to just read through, and that's why we do that during the sessions. Okay. The idea that somehow Bitcoin can be banned by governments is the final stage of grief right before acceptance. The consequence of the statement is an admission that Bitcoin works. In fact, it posits that Bitcoin works so well that it will threaten the incumbent government monopolies on money, in which case governments will regulate it out of existence to eliminate the threat. Think about the claim that governments will ban Bitcoin as conditional logic. Is Bitcoin functional as money? If not, governments have nothing to ban. If yes, then governments will attempt to ban Bitcoin. So the anchor point for this line of criticism assumes that Bitcoin is functional as money, and then the question becomes whether or not government intervention could successfully cause an otherwise functioning Bitcoin to fail. So yeah, just quick summary of this paragraph is that it's more a question of competence of both government and Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is not functional as money, it's not uh, worth anybody's time to try to ban something which is not even adding value. And if it is indeed functional as money, then it is a competition to fiat currencies, and then the question becomes that can government ban Bitcoin? As a starting point, anyone trying to understand how, why, or if Bitcoin works should assess the question entirely independent from the implications of government regulation or intervention. While Bitcoin will undoubtedly have to coexist alongside various regulatory regimes, imagine governments did not exist. On a standalone basis, would Bitcoin be functional as money if left to the free market? This will inevitably lead to a number of rabbit hole questions. What is money? What are the properties that make a particular medium a better or worse form of money? Does Bitcoin share those properties? Is Bitcoin a better form of money based on its properties? If the ultimate conclusion becomes that Bitcoin is not functional as money, the implications of government intervention are irrelevant. However, if Bitcoin is functional as money, the question then becomes relevant to the debate, and anyone considering the question would need that prior context as a baseline to evaluate whether or not it would be possible. So, yeah. So if you guys have some priming of economics beforehand, then I think these questions might not at least be new. So I think the article posits that it's important to. Hey Rishabh, thanks for joining. Uh, I don't know if I'll be able to give you any context, but if you have any questions, please ask directly and let me know if you're able to follow. So we had just started with like 1 minute in reading one or maybe 2, 3 minutes. Yeah. So so I think the article posits that it's first important to understand Bitcoin independently in the free market principle. So if you've studied Austin economics or have some basic idea of it, is that how it's done in physics of separating the experiment from external variables. How Austin economics studies economics is through human behavior outside of intervention of any external influence. So, to understand whether or not government can ban Bitcoin, first it becomes important to understand the monetary properties of government by and of itself. Uh, by design, Bitcoin exists beyond governments, but Bitcoin is not just beyond the control of governments, it functions without the coordination of any central third parties. It is global and decentralized. Anyone can access Bitcoin on a permissionless basis, and the more widespread it becomes, the more difficult it becomes to censor the network. The architecture of Bitcoin is practically purpose built to resist and immunize any attempts by governments to ban it. This is not to say that governments all over the world will not attempt to regulate, tax, or even ban its use. There will certainly be a fight to resist Bitcoin adoption. The Fed and the Treasury and their global counterparts are not just going to lay down as Bitcoin increasingly threatens the monopolies of government money. However, before debunking the idea that governments could outright ban Bitcoin, first understand the very consequence of the statement and the messenger. The progression of denial and stages of grief. The skeptic's narrative consistently shifts over time. Stage 1 of grief, Bitcoin could never work, it is backed by nothing. It is nothing more than a present day tulip mania. With each hype cycle, the value of Bitcoin rises dramatically and is then followed by a correction. Often extolled as a crash by skeptics, Bitcoin fails to die, and in each instance, it finds support at levels higher than prior adoption waves. The tulip narrative becomes tired, and the skeptics move on to more nuanced issues, re anchoring the debate. Stage 2 of grief follows. Bitcoin is flawed as a currency. it is too volatile to be money, or it is too slow to be a payment system, or it cannot scale to satisfy all the payments in the world, or it wastes energy. The list goes on. This second step is a progression of denial, and it is a significant departure from the idea that Bitcoin is nothing more than nothingness. Yeah. Just a quick pause. If somebody has watched that popular meme of, I think it's not Superman, but some superhero having the option to press one of the two red buttons, and it's a very popular Bitcoin meme. I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it right now, but yeah, if somebody has went over it, I'll anyway just share it, and they can. If somebody does not get the context, please let me know. The entire point is that a lot of the people who are new to Bitcoin, who might not be receptive to the idea of sound money, have this dilemma of if Bitcoin is not functional, then we should ban it. But it is functional because it is being used. So it becomes a dilemma whether its use is giving it value, or whether it's not valuable because it is not backed, quote unquote, by something. So yeah, so we have went over, I think, the backed by nothing part, and I think this is the link to the one of the first few articles of what Bitcoin is backed by. And just to give the brief summary, it is backed by its credible monetary properties. So it's a question of debate that some people say Bitcoin is backed by energy, or yeah, that's. I think proof of work is another technical word that is used to often say that Bitcoin is backed by proof of work. But I think it goes back to the same underlying root of Bitcoin being backed by energy. But the idea from economics is that Bitcoin is backed by credible monetary properties, and credible monetary properties are backed by individuals valuing it for their own individual reasons. But the reason is that it is scarce, it is auditable, it is divisible, etc. So yeah, so the point is that the evolution of skepticism around Bitcoin has evolved. First, it was that there is no intrinsic value to Bitcoin. Then it became about criticism of its volatility, of it being slow and not scalable. And yeah, the energy argument is also over the years evolved. I think only recently in the last 1 or 2 years, what I've observed is, especially after the BlackRock ETF, there's an entire narrative shift around the energy use of Bitcoin. It's not so much um, hurting the climate anymore. There are reports by KPMG and some of the other major outlets talking about how Bitcoin is ESG friendly now, but yeah, not wanting to go too much into that. Quick pause if somebody has any to share, any questions. Dhruval has posted in the chat having some issues with network, might join back after some time. Yep, yep. So no questions, I'll continue. Despite the supposed flaws, the value of the Bitcoin network continues to rise over time. Each time it does not die, it gains strength. While the skeptics are busy pointing out flaws, Bitcoin never sleeps. An increase in value is driven by a very simple market dynamic, more buyers than sellers. That is all, and it is a function of increasing adoption. More and more people figure out why there is fundamental demand for Bitcoin and why or how it works. This is what creates long term demand for Bitcoin. As more people increasingly demand it as a store of wealth, there is no supply response. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, no matter how many people demand Bitcoin. The supply side is completely fixed and inelastic. As the skeptics continue to shout the same tired lines, the crowd continues to parse the noise and demand Bitcoin due to the strength of its monetary properties. And no constituency is more well versed in the arguments against Bitcoin than adopters of Bitcoin themselves. Yep. I think, especially after 2020 and now with, I mean, there's a lot more mainstream awareness, if not adoption of Bitcoin. So, for better or worse, it has created this narrative around Bitcoin, which might or might not have been true in 2019. I wasn't personally into Bitcoin at the time, but what I think is from my reading of Bitcoin's evolution in history is that before the 2020 debacle of global order, Bitcoin was still a very niche thing. But yeah, I think a lot of libertarians and maybe ideological people were more inclined to understand Bitcoin. But I think over time it has evolved into many people being into it for their own reasons. Desperation begins to kick in, and the debate re-anchors once again. The narrative predictably shifts. It is no longer that Bitcoin is not backed by anything, nor that it is flawed as a currency. Instead, the debate centers on regulation and government authorities. In the final stage of grief, it is actually that Bitcoin works too well, and as a consequence, the government will never let it happen and ban it. Really? So human ingenuity somehow reinvents money in a technologically superior medium, the consequences of which are mind bending, and the government is somehow going to ban that. Recognize that in claiming as such, the skeptics are admitting defeat. It is the dying whimper in a series of failed arguments. The skeptics simultaneously accept that there is fundamental demand for Bitcoin and then pivot to the unfounded belief that governments can ban it. Yeah, so it's like self-reinforcing that whenever someone posits that Bitcoin has value, they are implyingly say whether or not they acknowledge it that it has value outside of any control or any entity that can have any say in whether or not Bitcoin should be regulated or banned, because that's the value proposition of Bitcoin, that it can be used by individuals without trust in any authority. Play this one out. When exactly would developed world governments actually step in and attempt to ban Bitcoin? Today, the Fed and the Treasury do not view Bitcoin as a serious threat to dollar supremacy. In their collective mind, Bitcoin is a cute little toy and it is not functional as a currency. Presently, the Bitcoin network represents a total purchasing power of less than 200 billion. Gold, on the other hand, has a purchasing power of approximately 8 trillion, 40 times the size of Bitcoin, and broad money supply of dollars. M2 is approximately 15 trillion, 75 times the size of Bitcoin. When does the Fed or Treasury start seriously considering Bitcoin a credible threat? Is it when Bitcoin collectively represents 1 trillion of purchasing power, 2 trillion, or 3 trillion? Pick your level, but the implication is that Bitcoin will be far more valuable and held by far more people globally before government powers that be view it as a credible competitor or threat. I think we have the advantage of hindsight now that Bitcoin has a market cap of, I think, about 1.3 trillion now. And I think the M2 money supply is definitely much bigger than 15 trillion. I think I've read around 35 trillion. It's definitely grown by orders of magnitude. And yeah, I think it's already a good question that it's not hit the 2 trillion or 3 trillion mark according to this question, but it's already much more valuable than it was 4 or 5 years ago in terms of at least price. So what we have seen that it's still not something that governments are actively even attempting to attack, because if anything, at least in my opinion, it will just reinforce its value proposition, which might not be in their best interest to attempt. And one example of this, interestingly, is of Donald Trump, which is quoted here. He's one of the speakers at Bitcoin 2024, and I don't want to go into too much detail of whether or not he's pro Bitcoin, but the entire idea is that acknowledgement of him, I believe, is a symptom of where we are in the adoption phase. Yeah, it opens up a can of worms of whether or not it's a good thing, but I think it's worth acknowledging that we are at a point where it's become unavoidable for anybody to not consider Bitcoin as a serious thing. Yeah, this is the quote. This is the quote also by Steve Munchin, the then Treasury Secretary. I'll just read the Donald Trump quote. I'm not a fan of Bitcoin, which is not money and whose value is highly volatile and based on thin air. This was in 2019.
I think when the author says that the Fed and the Treasury do not take Bitcoin seriously, it doesn't necessarily mean, or the author is not trying to imply that the Fed and the Treasury or the politicians will attack Bitcoin. By taking it seriously, it does not necessitate that they'll attack Bitcoin, but it can also imply that they'll acknowledge it. They'll start taking it seriously, which is what is happening today. Like the Fed and the Treasury and politicians are starting to acknowledge Bitcoin, and they're starting to admit that it's here to stay. They're not just thinking of it as something that's just going to pass by. It's not going to disappear. It's here to stay, and they are planning accordingly, and they are acknowledging it and taking it seriously. So I think we're living the text that we're reading.
Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, I think just one point that there is this popular picture, I think, which shared that in the 2009 to 2011 phase, Bitcoin was adopted by experimenters and ideologists, experimenters who were computer scientists and cryptographers and cypherpunks who were building on this thing, which was still an experiment by all sense, and ideologists, maybe some libertarian thinkers who were pro peer-to-peer money. And then from 2011 to 2014, it was speculators who were just, I think this was the era of altcoin introduction. So I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, whether altcoins really burst on in 2011 to 2014, but I know that speculation was starting to enter the economy on Bitcoin. And then 2014 to 2017 was the investor bubble where there was a lot of, again, altcoin at the helm of it. That I mean, the whole ICO thing and the entire narrative of Bitcoin's evolution and scale and Bitcoin Cash, everything started to emerge. And this crackdown started to empirically show that Bitcoin evolution will not happen through uh, by increasing the block size. And this started the 2017 to 2020 phase, which was when billionaires and more serious invest serious quote unquote, which by which I only mean companies and more traditional financial investments had started to look at it, which culminated in Michael Saylor adopting it as a treasury reserve strategy. And then 2020-24 is said to be the phase where nation states start to acknowledge it. And I think we are now at the helm of it by having the biggest um, investment firm in BlackRock creating the ETF, and more nations starting to talk about mining operations. Yeah, there's a lot of. I'm yet to dive deep into how mining centralization is a problem, but I know that nation states entering the picture, I think, has a role to play in that because um, whether or not it plays into the decentralization bit of it and how it affects the game theory, I don't know. But I know that after the China ban, when the hash rate moved to US, there's less than two or three companies which can effectively collude to control more than 51% hash rate. And that's a separate rabbit hole, whether or not 51% is the actual number or is it an attack vector. But yeah, just touching on some points that might be outside of the purview, but yeah, we can take it up maybe after 9 p.m. So the skeptic logic follows. Bitcoin does not work, but if it does work, the government will ban it. But governments in the free world will not attempt to ban Bitcoin until it becomes more apparent that it is a threat, at which time Bitcoin will be more valuable and undoubtedly harder to ban, as it will be held by far more people in far more places. So ignore fundamentals and the asymmetry inherent in a global monetization event, because in the event you turn out to be right, the government will step in to regulate Bitcoin out of existence. Which side of the fence would a rational economic actor rather be on? Owning a monetary asset that has increased in value so dramatically that it threatens the global reserve currency, or the opposite, not owning that asset? Assuming an individual possesses the knowledge to understand why it is a fundamental possibility and increasingly a probability, which is the more defensible and logical position? The asymmetry alone dictates the former, and any fundamental understanding of the demand for Bitcoin only reinforces the same position. Yeah, just Satoshi quote came into my mind of, I think, not to exactly quote him because I don't want to mess that. But I think it goes on the lines of, in case might as well want to get some of it in case it catches on, and if enough people start to understand and think that, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, I think the asymmetry in adopting Bitcoin speaks for itself. That the value proposition is so high that any rational economic actor, that this, as this paragraph says, is is more likely to be on that side of the fence of storing some wealth in it. Yeah, this is a Michael Goldstein quote. I think Bitcoin is a strange game where the only winning move is to play. And this is from 2019. What we discussed above is the market cap of Bitcoin being very almost cartoonishly small in front of gold and USD M2, where there are very sound reasons to be made that both of them are very inferior in their properties compared to Bitcoin. This is the global M2, which I think euro dollar forms a large part of it. I'm very new to euro dollar, but I'm really fascinated by the claim that it's the reserve currency more than the US dollar itself. Yeah, we're about at 8:30. I'll begin this paragraph. But again, just saying that if somebody wants to share any ideas at any time, please feel free. But Bitcoin cannot be banned. Think about what Bitcoin actually represents and then what a ban of Bitcoin would represent. Bitcoin represents the conversion of subjective value created and exchanged in the real world for digital keys. Said more plainly, it is the conversion of an individual's time into money. When someone demands Bitcoin, they are at the same time foregoing demand for some other good, whether it be a dollar, a house, a car, or food, etc. Bitcoin represents monetary savings that comes with the opportunity cost of other goods and services. Banning Bitcoin would be an affront to the most basic freedoms it is designed to both provide and preserve. Imagine the response by all those that have adopted Bitcoin. Well, that was fun. The tool that the experts said would never work now works too well, and the same experts and authorities say we can't use it. Everyone go home, shows over, folks. To believe that all the people in the world that have adopted Bitcoin for the financial freedom and sovereignty it provides would suddenly lay down and accept the ultimate infringement of that freedom is not rational. I think yeah, this paragraph perfectly captures what exactly is happening. The way I started to put a framework for myself is that Bitcoin is a message on the internet, and if somebody has a problem with that, then we have more fundamental questions to be concerned about, because humans, if they are not able to freely communicate with each other, then the entire building block of what we call civilization or society breaks down. And I think yeah, it's very self-reinforcing that if enough people start adopting Bitcoin, that it becomes a threat. Then anybody who's trying to attack it will find that those people are not incentivized to now just give up on the sovereignty and freedom and value that it has created for them. This is the famous Frederick Hayek quote: "Money is one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented by man. It is money which, in existing society, opens an astounding range of choice to the poor man, a range greater than that which not many generations ago was open to the wealthy." And just sharing my understanding of it is especially specialization of trade. Any person who has some value that they can create, whether or not they are consumers of that value themselves, what money allows them is to engage in trade with people who are demanding those value. So yeah, very fundamentally just reinforcing the point that money solves the problem of double coincidence of wants, and a free market money allows you to engage with whoever is valuing the service or good that you can create. And I think there are more such quotes where Frederick Hayek talks about more about that money is the solution to war and hate, because it creates this an incentive structure of cooperating with the people that you don't even like, because there is value to be found in trading with each other. Governments could not successfully ban the consumption of alcohol, the use of drugs, the purchase of firearms, or the ownership of gold. A government can marginally restrict access or even make possession illegal, but it cannot make something of value demanded by a broad and disparate group of people magically go away. When the US made the private ownership of gold illegal in 1933, gold did not lose its value or disappear as a monetary medium. It actually increased in value relative to the dollar, and just 30 years later, the ban was lifted. Not only does Bitcoin provide a greater value proposition relative to any other good that any government has ever attempted to ban, including gold, but by its nature, it is also far harder to ban. Bitcoin is global and decentralized. It is without borders, and it is secured by nodes and cryptographic keys. The act of banning Bitcoin would require preventing open source software code from being run and preventing digital signatures created by cryptographic keys from being broadcast on the internet. And it would have to be coordinated across numerous jurisdictions, except there is no way to know where the keys actually reside or to prevent more nodes from popping up in different jurisdictions. Setting aside the constitutional issues, it would be technically infeasible to enforce a ban of Bitcoin in any meaningful way. I can't remember the exact website. I don't know if it was earn.com, but I think there's a popular website which shows the exact number of nodes running in jurisdiction, the public Bitcoin nodes. I think India had about somewhere in double digits, around 50 or 60. And this is the reachable Bitcoin nodes in 2019.
There are lots of them. There's the bitnodes.com, there's coindance.com, lots and lots of them.
Yep, yep. I think the overall number is around, the last I checked, I think it was a few months ago, was around 30 or 35,000 public Bitcoin nodes. But yeah, the awesome thing about privacy is that we will never know the actual number of Bitcoin nodes running.
Public nodes, as of now, I think are around 12,000 because more and more people are shifting to Tor and I2P. So public nodes that are running are around 12,000 right now, slightly less than 12,000.
Thanks.
So, a couple of days back, there was some issue about star nodes suddenly going offline.
Right, that's fixed now. Back then it
Was
was
it
showing
some?
hardly a few thousand, I think 2,000, 3,000, or 1,000, something like that. Now it's showing around 11, 12,000. So that issue is sorted now.
Was it something to do with the tar itself, or
I don't know. I didn't dig too much into it, but yeah, a few people brought it to my notice that the number of Tor nodes is showing it's showing 90% less than it should. But today in the morning again, the same person brought it to my notice that the number of nodes have been reverted back. But I didn't look into what exactly the matter was.
okay, okay.
Yeah, quick question on the context. From what I understand about the Tor, that the exit nodes need to connect to the local ISP, right? Which is the point of attack on Tor nodes. So, anybody has any ideas that was that the reason that exit nodes starting to get attacked? Maybe we'll look into it after the session if time permits.
I have no idea why this happened, but whatever was the issue, it's been sorted now.
Luke Dasher was pointing out that there was some issue with the way that people are detecting and counting tar nodes. So I have also not spent much time on it. Yeah.
I doubt that would be the case because it did not happen at it did not happen at a specific website. Like it was like different people use different mechanisms and run different servers to track the traffic of nodes. Right? Luke maintains his own implementation. So even on Luke's website, I went to Luke's website. Even on his website, the number depreciated. So there was some global issue that happened.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I'll continue. Even if all countries in the G20 coordinated to ban Bitcoin in unison, it would not kill Bitcoin. Instead, it would be the fait accompli for the fiat system. It would reinforce to the masses that Bitcoin is a formidable currency, and it would set off a global and hopeless game of whack-a-mole. There is no central point of failure in Bitcoin. Bitcoin miners, nodes, and keys are distributed throughout the world. Every aspect of Bitcoin is decentralized, which is why running nodes and controlling keys is core to Bitcoin. The more keys and the more nodes that exist, the more decentralized Bitcoin becomes, and the more immune Bitcoin is to attack. The more jurisdictions in which mining exists, the less risk any single jurisdiction represents to Bitcoin's security function. A coordinated state level attack would only serve to build the strength of Bitcoin's immune system. It would ultimately accelerate the shift away from legacy financial system and legacy currencies, and it would accelerate innovation within the Bitcoin economic system. With each passing threat, Bitcoin innovates to immunize the threat. A coordinated state level attack would be no different. I hope this is pretty self explanatory. But yeah, the banks are the opaque points of accounting in the traditional central monetary systems. The entire idea here is that every node is independently verifying the blockchain. Permissionless innovation on a globally decentralized basis is the reason Bitcoin gains strength from every attack. It is the attack vector itself which causes Bitcoin to innovate. It is Adam Smith's invisible hand on steroids. Individual actors may believe themselves to be motivated by a greater cause, but in reality, the utility embedded in Bitcoin creates a sufficiently powerful incentive structure to ensure its survival. The self-interests of millions, if not billions, of uncoordinated individuals, aligned by their individual and collective need for money, incentivizes permissionless innovation on top of Bitcoin. Today, it may seem like a cool new technology or a nice to have portfolio investment, but even if most people do not yet recognize it, Bitcoin is a necessity. It is a necessity because money is a necessity and legacy currencies are fundamentally broken. 2 months ago, the repo markets in the US broke, and the Fed quickly responded by increasingly increasing the supply of dollars by $250 billion, with more to come. It is precisely why Bitcoin is a necessity, not a luxury. When an innovation happens to be a basic necessity to the functioning of an economy, there is no government force that could ever hope to stop its proliferation. Money is a very basic necessity, and Bitcoin represents a step function change innovation in the global competition for money. And just to highlight, thanks for joining us, Bala. I think you joined us after, or I might have missed it. But yeah, just the quick context that I shared with the rest of the group is I went over the podcast that you shared on the general channel. I was halfway through it, and I think I went down the euro dollar rabbit hole as well. And I was, to say the least, a lot of the things were new to me, so I was not able to understand. But the claim that I think I just wanted to share, and I shared it before, that euro dollar is said to be the more reserve currency, having a greater claim over being a reserve currency than US dollars. And there's a nuance that I think is important to understand. But yeah, I think I just use that to also highlight that $250 billion is perhaps now nothing in, I mean, when the time this article was written, this was the recent event. But I think what has happened, it, even in the last 1 year with the interest payments, is, I mean, it's insanely crazy. Yeah. And more practically, any attempt to ban Bitcoin or heavily regulate its use by any jurisdiction would directly benefit a competing jurisdiction. The incentive to defect from any coordinated effort to ban Bitcoin would be far too high to sustain such an agreement across jurisdictions. I'll read this again. The incentive to defect from any coordinated effort to ban Bitcoin would be far too high to sustain such an agreement across jurisdictions. If the United States made the possession of Bitcoin illegal tomorrow, would it slow down proliferation, development, and adoption of Bitcoin? And would it cause the value of the network to decline intermittently? Probably. Would it kill Bitcoin? No. Bitcoin represents the most mobile capital in the world. Countries and jurisdictions that create regulatory certainty and place the least amount of restrictions on the use of Bitcoin will benefit significantly from capital inflows. This is the banning Bitcoin prisoner's dilemma. So I think this is country A and B cooperating. When Bitcoin wins, ban fails, Bitcoin adoption accelerates, fiat currencies deteriorate more rapidly. This is when one country cooperates and one country, defects, and this is in the banning of Bitcoin. Yep. So just falling back on the concept that when both countries want to ban Bitcoin and they cooperate, Bitcoin wins because ban will eventually fail because it will allow other competing jurisdictions to take advantage of Bitcoin adoption, and it accelerates it, and it deteriorates the fiat currencies of other competing jurisdictions who are trying to ban it. One country accepting the ban and one country failing to do that is when Bitcoin wins, because capital outflows from the country who is banning it to the country which is accepting it. And yeah, the otherwise case. And the best case scenario will, of course, be the countries accepting it when everyone wins, benefits from trade and specialization. In practice, the prisoner's dilemma is not one-to-one, it is multidimensional, involving numerous jurisdictions, all with competing interests, making any attempts to successfully ban Bitcoin that much more impractical. Human capital, physical capital, and monetary capital will flow to the countries and jurisdictions with the least restrictive regulations on Bitcoin. It may not happen overnight, but attempting to ban Bitcoin is the equivalent of a country cutting off its nose to spite its face. It doesn't mean that countries will not try. India has already tried to ban Bitcoin. China has attempted to heavily restrict its use. Others will follow. But each time a country takes an action to restrict the use of Bitcoin, it actually has the unintended effect of promoting Bitcoin adoption. Attempts to ban Bitcoin are an extremely effective marketing tool for Bitcoin. Bitcoin exists as a non sovereign, censorship resistant form of money. It is designed to exist beyond the state. Attempts to ban Bitcoin merely serve to reinforce Bitcoin's reason for existence and ultimately its value proposition. The only winning move is to play. Banning Bitcoin is a fool's errand. Some will try, all will fail, and the very attempts to ban Bitcoin will accelerate its adoption and proliferation. It will be the 100 mile per hour wind that fuels the wildfire. It will also make Bitcoin stronger and more reliable, further immunizing it from attack and reinforcing its anti-fragile nature. And in any case, believing governments will ban Bitcoin if it becomes a credible threat to global reserve currencies is an irrational reason to discount it as a savings technology. Both seeds that Bitcoin is viable as money, while at the same time ignoring the principal reasons as to why: decentralization and censorship resistance. Imagine understanding the greatest present secret in the world and not capitalizing on the asymmetry and utility that Bitcoin provides in fear of government. More likely, either someone understands why Bitcoin works and that it will not fail at the hands of a government, or a knowledge gap exists as to how Bitcoin is able to function in the first place. Begin by understanding the fundamentals and then apply that as a baseline to assess any potential risk posed by future government intervention or regulation, and never discount the value of asymmetry. The only winning move is to play. We have reached the end of this piece. We'll take a 1 minute pause. Hmm. Right, if nobody has anything to share, I think we can start the next piece, which is Bitcoin is not for criminals. If you have ever heard or happen to believe that Bitcoin is primarily a tool used by criminals, stop and take a quick sample of your friends and family that you suspect may own Bitcoin, and then ask yourself how many are known criminals. There have, in fact, been widely publicized cases in which criminals have used Bitcoin, and because skeptics cannot otherwise explain why anyone else would use it, use for illicit purposes becomes the default assumption. It is generally founded on a view that Bitcoin is inferior to the dollar, either because of the belief that it is too volatile or too slow, or because it is not widely accepted for day to day transactions. With a flawed mental framework, the logical explanation then becomes that, from a practical perspective, someone would only use Bitcoin for the purpose of facilitating some illicit activity, generally as a means to evade law enforcement. Your favorite senator or treasury secretary may occasionally make the claim, but thankfully, Bitcoin is not for criminal. It is, however, for everyone. Yeah, I think most of you might be aware of the trope of every innovative technology being used first by criminal elements, and the reason for that is that their incentive structure is more geared towards being optimal in using their energy. But yeah, the point is that Bitcoin is just a tool, and any use of it is just a human interpretation of its morality. But Bitcoin itself remains a neutral tool, and whether or not it's used for good or evil is up to the humans using it to decide, and it does not affect in any way the tool itself or the value that it can create for people who are not using it for any evil purpose. But yeah, this is a very complex debate in my opinion, and I think it depends on the person, um, on person to person, to be able to articulate why such arguments are quite frivolous to make that Bitcoin is used by illicit activities. The clear ends of Bitcoin for either transacting in illegal goods and services or speculative gambling makes me wary of its use. This was letter to Senator Joe Manchin in 2014. If Bitcoin were principally used for illicit purposes, it may more logically follow that Bitcoin is primarily used by criminals. Because it is not the typical follow on arguments that Bitcoin should be banned in order to prevent such activities, similarly do not hold water. The very foundation of the idea is based on the false premise that Bitcoin is inferior to the dollar, when in fact it is superior to any form of money that has previously existed, principally as a function of its fixed supply. These are the two pieces that were part of the series. Bitcoin is not backed by nothing, and Bitcoin is not a pyramid scheme. Bitcoin's fixed supply forms the basis of the fundamental demand for Bitcoin, whether it be related to criminal activity or otherwise. And regardless of how many point of sale transactions Bitcoin may facilitate daily, it is used every day as a censorship resistant and inflation resistant form of savings. Without doubt, Bitcoin is definitely used by the likes of drug dealers and nefarious characters on the dark web. However, it would be irrational to believe that its primary use, or to believe Bitcoin should be banned because of it. It is logically inconsistent to form a view that Bitcoin is sufficiently functional to be viable as a currency for criminals, while at the same time deny the implication that such a view would merely establish that Bitcoin is functional for everyone. Let me read this again. It is logically inconsistent to form a view that Bitcoin is sufficiently functional to be viable as a currency for criminal, while at the same time deny the implication that such a view would merely establish that Bitcoin is functional for everyone. Yep. This is the flowchart of Bitcoin being functional. No, Bitcoin is not functional for criminals or anyone else. And if it is indeed functional, it is functional for everyone, including criminals. But before turning the drugs narrative completely upside down, let's all first admit that criminals rely upon any number of commonly trafficked access points, and not just Bitcoin. Roads, the internet, the postal service, airports, the banking system, etc. Yep, all used by criminals and often used to facilitate crimes. But then again, criminals also use all of the above not to commit crimes as well. That is where the logic that Bitcoin must be banned because it enables criminal activity completely breaks down. Crimes are crimes. There is nothing inherent about the tools used to facilitate crime that makes them criminal in themselves. Using the mail to send a letter to mom is not a crime, but using the mail to send drugs is mail fraud. Similarly, using the dollar to purchase flowers for mom, perfectly fine, but buying narcotics with dollars or Bitcoin, that's crime. Despite criminal use, no one is calling for the ban of roads, the internet, mail, etc. And you definitely do not see any prominent defenders of the public interest calling for a ban of the dollar, which just happens to be the preferred funding currencies of criminals everywhere. Sure, the fear of criminal activity has been used to infringe on the rights of law abiding citizens seemingly everywhere, but believing Bitcoin should be banned because drug dealers use it would be no different than calling for a ban on the dollar for the same reason. Yeah, I think the way that governments have approached the problem of criminals using any free market activity for that matter beyond just Bitcoin is total surveillance, which is equivalent to saying that just because you have knives at home, we need to watch over all of your activities. So that's the common narrative, sadly, in the world. But it just goes on to show that tools themselves are used for all sorts of purposes and can never be used as an argument to ban their use. Missing the point, such a view becomes that much more untenable once it is understood that Bitcoin is not actually for criminals. But in order to understand that, it must also be understood that Bitcoin is for criminals. It's a paradox. The very idea is turned on its head when viewed through the proper lens. The fact that criminals can use and have used Bitcoin to facilitate commerce merely demonstrate that Bitcoin can be used to facilitate any form of commerce. That a very early and well publicized use case for Bitcoin involved the Silk Road website, which facilitated transactions involving drugs and other illicit goods using Bitcoin as a means of payment, changes nothing about the broader implication that Bitcoin worked. But rather than focus here, Bitcoin research often attempts to prove the counterfactual that only a small percentage of Bitcoin transactions are used for illicit purposes. For example, a headline from last year, this is from Coin Center. A new study finds less than 1% of Bitcoin transactions to exchanges are illicit. The substance may be true, but these counter narratives fight the battle along the wrong lines. I'll read this again. Substance may be true, but these counter narratives fight the battle along the wrong lines. If the Silk Road demonstrated anything, it was simply that individuals would accept Bitcoin as a form of payment in return for goods and services. It does not matter that the goods sold on Silk Road website were generally illicit. The Silk Road, which is estimated to have facilitated in excess of a million transactions, was one of the earliest demonstrations of a mass real world use case for Bitcoin. So, yes, Bitcoin is and was used for drug deals, but it is merely one use case that has helped prove Bitcoin's general utility, nothing more. And when it comes to buying drugs, the dollar remains far preferred to Bitcoin among drug dealers, despite all generally being aware of Bitcoin and capable of accepting it. whether it be in response to the Silk Road or otherwise. Anyone that comes away with the narrow conclusion that Bitcoin works for drugs is failing to see the forest through the trees. The more consequential and assumption shattering implication is simply that Bitcoin works, period. Yeah, so yeah, pretty loaded subject, but I think it's important nonetheless to just recognize that Bitcoin's use is reinforced when two human beings, two adults consenting to engage in free market activity are able to use it. And yeah, so there's a narrative and discussion around how Monero has become more favorable for dark web activities, which proves that Bitcoin is actually not used by criminals, which I think this couple of paragraphs highlight that that might not be a good argument. Wow. If Bitcoin could work for drug dealers to facilitate commerce, could it not work to facilitate any other form of commerce? It does not require much imagination to carry forward the logic. If person A would accept Bitcoin for good B, is it possible that any person might be willing to accept Bitcoin for any good, regardless of who or what? In the case of the Silk Road, drug dealers may not have fully understood why Bitcoin worked, but it worked sufficiently well that they were willing to trade drugs for it. What they seemingly understood was that there was sufficient market demand for Bitcoin to make it viable as a medium of exchange because it provided an electronic mechanism to facilitate transactions. It opened up a market and market mechanism that may have otherwise been unavailable. Love it or hate it was just a market taking advantage of new technology. Yeah, so yeah, somebody can walk over this flowchart by exchanges, currency for BTC, an exchange by transfer BTC to Silk Road's account. I'll just take one quick pause and I'm just I mean, input from Jatin and I think Faisal and Bala could also help and some of the regular participants. I'm not sure if you want to be recording a session related to Silk Road, just a query that I'm passing by this group. So Jatin, if you want to stop streaming or at least take this up for discussion, if anybody has any thoughts or concern or yep. So what I'll do is I'll
It's a
read.
part of the book, right? The book is published, right? The book is publicly available. It's being sold on Amazon, India, and USA. You're
Right.
just reading from the book, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, the only reason I think it was important is just to help others also realize that if at all they are concerned, then please let us know. But yeah, thanks, Faisal. That's a very valid point. Yep. So I'll just quickly walk over this flowchart. Is that the buyer can receive Bitcoin from somebody who has any form of currency, whether it be Bitcoin directly or conversion through dollars. They can use it to purchase, and this is the price that they pay of using that platform. And yep, this is what Bitcoin allows in terms of specialization, like I
So
was
also
highlighting.
Silk Road was an open market. People could sell and buy anything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yep. I think recently Ross Ulbricht has also access to internet itself, and he's I mean, pretty strong advocate for that, for the fact that he's done nothing wrong, and it's one of those tragic things in Bitcoin's evolution that he's having to do this inside prison. But yeah, it goes on to show what the value proposition of censorship resistance is, and the lack of acknowledgement by a lot of people. Despite the existence of Bitcoin, drug dealers have not magically stop accepting dollars as their preferred funding currency, nor have they stopped laundering dollars back into the banking system. Drug dealers on the Silk Road did not use Bitcoin merely to evade law enforcement, nor did the dollar drug trade suddenly disappear. They used Bitcoin because it was functional and because it satisfied a market need. If Bitcoin were not functional and if it were not expected to hold a certain threshold of value over a particular time horizon, it would have not been used as a medium of exchange on the Silk Road. Drug dealers are not in the money losing business after all. But more importantly, anytime anyone decries that Bitcoin is used by criminals for illicit purposes, whether it be a US senator or treasury secretary, the default question to ask should be, why does Bitcoin work as a medium to facilitate commerce in the first place? the litmus test. Focusing on criminals distracts from the more fundamental question and consequence. If Bitcoin could work for a criminal, it could work for anyone. And in order for Bitcoin to be viable as a currency, it has to work for everyone, including criminals. However, this is not a promotion of criminal activity using Bitcoin as a funding mechanism. It is merely a recognition of the properties that allow Bitcoin to function in the first place. Think of criminal activities as a litmus test. If Bitcoin does not work for drug dealers, it doesn't work for anyone. If it works for drug dealers, it can work for everyone. If it were possible to censor or prevent Bitcoin transactions related to certain activity or individuals, it would be possible to censor any activity and any individuals. And if there were a prime target of activities or individuals to censor, it would be that of a criminal enterprise. The attempts have already begun. This is from Coindesk in 2019. The US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned three Chinese nationals and their cryptocurrency addresses, alleging that they violated money laundering and drug smuggling laws. The agency also listed a number of Bitcoin addresses that the agency claims belongs to the Chinese citizens. Yeah, so I think just one anecdote from recent news is that Mt. Gox, the Bitcoin that were hacked in the Mt. Gox hacked, I think was sold off recently by the US government. It also caused a major a blip rather in the price, but it was interesting that this were official sell of Bitcoin, which was in the account books of US Treasury, which was recovered from the Mt. Gox hack. And I think Silk Road Bitcoin are also officially accounted for in US Treasury balance sheet. Yeah, there's a whole documentary around it, which I think is interesting to watch. Recognize that in this context, Bitcoin working is specifically a reference to the network protocol layer, whether a company or individual is willing to access Bitcoin from an address sanctioned by OFAC, or whether a third-party financial institution freezes an account associated with such an address, is of little consequence to the long-term viability of Bitcoin. What is consequential is whether the network would validate a transaction originated from a sanctioned address or validate a block that includes such a transaction. Stated another way, whether Bitcoin miners or nodes would reject such a transaction despite it otherwise being valid based on the network's consensus rules. Bitcoin is only viable as a currency because it is decentralized, but decentralization is not an end in itself. The end game is censorship resistance, and it is not an end game to protect criminals. It is an end game to protect the very root level functioning of the currency system. Yeah, I think this title itself says it all. And just quick shout out to Noster as well. It's like Fuck You Money needed a complimentary Fuck You speech platform that if it is like if you can be debanked, you will be, and if you can be censored in speech, you will be. Censorship resistance is all or nothing. Censorship resistance is the network's most critical property because it ensures that the rules of the network will neither change arbitrarily or be enforced inconsistently, without which the system would be inoperable. Most important of these rules is the finite scarcity of the currency itself. Censorship resistance reinforces scarcity, and scarcity reinforces censorship resistance. Bitcoin becomes more resistant to censorship as it scales because the network becomes more decentralized over time. As adoption increases, each individual, on average, controls an ever diminishing share of the network's fixed supply, and it is the scarcity of the currency which primarily drives adoption. As the network becomes further decentralized, it becomes increasingly difficult for any individual or business to censor the network. However, at any point in time, whether Bitcoin is sufficiently censorship resistant is ultimately unknown and practically unknowable. Instead, censorship resistance can only be measured through the test of time and through each failed attempt to censor the network. The only metric I think could be just the number of nodes being run and the ability of individuals to run a node. These are the metrics I believe to measure censorship resistance. But yeah, practically it is unknowable because until we see enough attempts at censoring transactions, there is no way to know. From a practical perspective, we have reached the 9.5 mark. So what I'll do is I think it's better to take a pause because this will abruptly stop if we cover the next paragraph. But I think censorship resistance is all or nothing is the wherewithal catch that we can end with. Yep, yep, yep. Thank you everybody for listening and participating. But yeah, any thoughts and comments? I think we can stop the streaming now, Jatin, if that's okay. Jatin, you were unmuted, but I don't think you were audible. In case you spoke something. I don't think I can hear you, Jatin. Uh, oh, right, I saw your text. Yeah, you're welcome, Rishabh. Thanks for joining. And May is stop the yeah. I think you can stop the stream. I see a different number of people in the lounge on the side panel and a different number on the screen. Can someone confirm? I see Bala and Faisal are there, and Imdab.
Yes, there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 people, including you.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, Jatin, thanks. Yeah, okay. So thank you guys. Have a good night. I had one or two questions for Bala in case you're free, or maybe I'll catch up with you later.
I'll make a move, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks, Shan. Bye. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night, Faisal.
Thank you. Bye bye.